Hello, and welcome to the Uncommon Commander channel. My name is Ryan, and I hope you enjoy this video. Today we're presenting a Pauper EDH deck, so we'll be using an uncommon creature as our commander, and the rest of the 99 will all be cards that have been printed at the common level of rarity. A special thank you to Wikipedia, from whom I've unwittingly and completely stolen the entire flavor and storyline section for Planar Chaos from. It reads as follows. Dominaria's temporal fabric is no longer fraying at the edges. It's rippling down the middle. The time rifts have not only merged with the past and the present, but also splintered the timeline into thousands of alternate histories. These divergent Dominarias overlap with the known world in bizarre ways, combining the familiar with the shockingly new. Teferi, having lost his Planeswalker's spark, still struggles to mend the planar rifts before they corrode the very structure of the multiverse. With his allies, Joyra and Venser, he has already succeeded in restoring the wayward region of Shiv to its natural place in Dominaria, healing one rift. But danger awaits them as the trio attempts to teleport to Urborg, the chaos of an alternate Dominaria. From this muck crawls the Necrotic Sliver. Coiled around a creepy ruined pillar with a face on it, this Orzhov Sliver costs a generic, a white, and a black mana to cast, has a 2/2 body, and has an ability that reads, all slivers gain, pay 3 generic mana, and sacrifice this sliver. Destroy target permanent. Any target permanent. Now, we're never really going to have enough slivers to do mass land destruction, but targeted land destruction is certainly on the table. But seriously, what is the deal with that face? Anyway, the primary way we're going to win with this deck is by churning through our library as quickly as possible and playing low mana costed slivers to create a small army we can swing with or sacrifice in order to remove our opponent's threats. This deck uses its graveyard as a second library, has some death triggers, and also has a few haymakers. Quickly drawing through our deck gets us to those as quickly as possible. Basically, this is a 2-colored Sliver Tribal deck with some self-mill and a couple of nasty surprises thrown in. As always, if you enjoy the content here, please remember to like and subscribe to help this channel grow, and remember, you can find the deck list at the tappedout.com link below. This deck runs pretty low to the ground, with an average converted mana cost of 2.78. But we are still going to ramp pretty hard in this deck relative to the low mana curve. We'll start with the Commander's Quarters favorite, a PDH favorite, and, if I'm being honest, one of my favorites, Wayfarer's Bauble. We can play this on turn 1 and crack it open on turn 2 to find and put a land card into play. Well, it's highly unlikely that you've found my channel before finding the Commander's Quarters channel. If that has happened to you, check out the Commander's Quarters. It's a great YouTube channel. Next we have Mind Stone, Orzhov Signet, and Prismatic Lens. These all cost 2 mana, and while Prismatic Lens and Orzhov Signet help you with color fixing, Mind Stone can be sacrificed when you no longer need it in order to draw a card. Churning quickly through our deck is a main focus in this deck, and Mind Stone doesn't do it well, but it does at least help with it. Up next we have our first 3 mana costed ramp cards, and our first sliver, in Basil Sliver, along with Commander's Sphere and Orazca Relic. Basil Sliver helps ramping by turning each sliver card into a dark ritual style of effect, while Commander's Sphere and Orazca Relic do a decent impersonation of the Mind Stone. Finally, Orzhov Cluestone and Orzhov Locket close out our ramp cards. Both of these tap for either a white or a black mana, and both help us churn through our deck by allowing us to sacrifice them when we no longer need them in order to draw cards. This deck has a lot of card draw, and the purest form comes from a bunch of black sorceries. Can we call black cards pure when black is the power at any cost color in MTG? Yes, we can. First up, we have Night's Whisper and Sign in Blood. Both cost 2 mana, and both require us to lose 2 life and draw 2 cards. Next, we have Casting of Bones, which costs 3 mana, and is an enchantment aura that reads, when enchanted creature dies, draw 3 cards, then discard 1 of them. We'll want to put this on a sliver that we plan to sacrifice anyway, and when we do, we'll get to draw those cards. We also have Foreboding Fruit and Live Fast. These are simply 3 mana versions of Sign in Blood and Night's Whisper. Simple. In the same vein, we have Painful Lesson and Read the Bones. They also cost 3 mana and operate the same way, except that Read the Bones will allow you to scry 2 cards first. Our 2 most expensive draw spells are Moriok Replica and Siphon Mind. Moriok Replica costs a lot between casting it and paying for its ability, but it can be pulled out of our graveyard with recursion spells, and Siphon Mind is both card draw for us and discard for our opponents. While building this deck, I put just about as much card draw as I possibly could into it, and I still find myself running out of things to cast very quickly. So I asked myself, if I were playing a deck that had black in it, what would I do to correct this issue? Well, I guess I'd use my graveyard. Oh, and what do you know, this deck does have black in it. To this end, I've added cards that allow us to mill ourselves. As a special note, do not try milling your opponents with these cards. There aren't enough of them, so you can't actually mill out your opponents from the game, and you'll end up just populating their graveyard instead of your own. First among these cards are Corpse Churn and Ransack the Lab. Both cost 2 mana, and while Corpse Churn allows you to put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, then return any creature from your graveyard to your hand, Ransack the Lab acts more like a cantrip in that it allows you to look at the top 3 cards of your library, choose one of them to go into your hand, and then put the others into your graveyard. I will reiterate that with Corpse Churn, you can return any creature card to your hand, not just one of the 3 that you milled. Up next we have Bitter Revelation and Dark Bargain. Bitter Revelation costs 4 mana and allows you to look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of those into your hand, and the other 2 into your graveyard. You do lose 2 life as well. Dark Bargain costs 4 and only allows you to look at the top 3 cards of your library. You put 2 into your hand and the other into your graveyard, and the spell deals 2 damage to you. It rarely matters and probably won't ever really matter with this deck, but life loss and damage are 2 different things. We also have Stinkweed Imp and Return Centaur. At 3 mana, Stinkweed Imp acts as a great blocker, and then after he's dead, allows you to dredge 5. That's a pretty big dredge, and allows you to populate the graveyard very quickly. Return Centaur has an Enter the Battlefield ability that mills you for 4 cards. Now that we've got all these cards in our graveyard, we're going to want to be able to use them. One option will be to reanimate the creatures in the graveyard, putting them directly into play without paying their mana costs. The problem with this at the common level is that you're only returning 1 creature at a time, and usually that's got strings attached, like the CMC requirement on Unearth. Instead, I've decided to put in cards that will allow us to bring multiple creatures from our graveyard to our hand. This requires us to hardcast those creatures once we have them, but it also gives us card advantage by refilling our hand. We'll start with 2 enchantments. The lowest CMC one is Soulstare Expedition. It only costs a black mana to cast, but does require us to have 3 landfalls before we can sacrifice it to return up to 2 creature cards from our graveyard to our hand. Next, Font of Return costs a lot at 6 total mana between casting it and using its ability, but can be allowed to sit on the battlefield until we need it, and then it can be activated at instant speed. Now we get to our sorceries. The first 2 of these are going to be Return from Extinction and Wander in Death. Return from Extinction allows us to pick one of 2 modes. Usually we'll be using the second mode, as we have a lot of creatures that share a type. And I also love that the card depicts Slivers rising from the dead, which is exactly what we're trying to do here with it. Flavor wins are always appreciated on this channel. Wander in Death can be used to return 2 creature cards from the graveyard to hand, but can also be cycled if the situation calls for it. Our final 2 recursion spells are Aphedo Dredging and Urborg Uprising. Aphedo Dredging costs 4 mana, but returns 3 creatures to hand instead of 2, while Urborg Uprising costs 1 more mana and allows us to bring 2 cards back from the graveyard to our hand, and then draw a card, and get slightly creeped out by its art. I was actually really close to adding in Cabal Surgeon into this deck as well, but decided not to. She's an engine, which is rare among common cards, but does require a heavy mana investment and uses up our graveyard very quickly. This is a fine thing if we've milled a bunch of non-creature spells and lands into it, but also causes this card to be a dud more often than you may like it to be. Still, if you don't like Urborg Uprising, this is the card I'd recommend to replace it with. To be clear, this card is not in the 99 for this deck, but does fit if you do want it there. I did also notice that Cabal Surgeon has gauged earlobes. Obviously, this is irrefutable evidence that people with gauged ears are evil. Okay, so we've talked about how this deck runs. Now let's get into the meat. Slivers are made of meat, right? Slivers are pretty bite-sized on their own, like a fun treat for your opponent's creatures to snack on, but like a Zerg swarm, the more individuals there are, the more dangerous they each become. We have a lot of slivers that act as anthems for the rest of our slivers, making the sliver army more dangerous as we get more and more of them onto the battlefield. Plated Sliver, Sinew Sliver, and Watcher Sliver are classic anthems. Plated Sliver costs 1 mana and gives all slivers +0/+1. Sinew Sliver costs 2 mana and gives all slivers +1/+1. And Watcher Sliver costs 4 mana and gives all slivers +0/+2. Some that make combat more difficult for opponents are Sidewinder Sliver, Frenzy Sliver, and Lymph Sliver. Sidewinder costs 1 mana and gives each sliver flanking, which causes creatures blocking your slivers to get -1/-1 until the end of the turn, while Frenzy Sliver gives each of your slivers Frenzy 1, meaning each unblocked sliver gets +1/+0 until the end of the turn if they attack and aren't blocked. That's a nice little combo that makes your enemies think a bit before declaring blockers. Lymph Sliver gives each sliver Absorb 1, which means that they take 1 fewer damage from every source, making them a bit more durable. We have 3 slivers that give the first strike keyword to each sliver in Talon Sliver, Lancer Sliver, and Spitting Sliver. They cost 2 mana, 3 mana, and 5 mana respectively, and also have bodies of 1/1, 2/2, and 3/3 respectively. Our final sliver that gives a passive anthem is Sentinel Sliver, who costs 2 mana, has a 2/2 body, and gives each sliver vigilance. Some of our slivers give utility rather than anthem effects. 2 that give protection are Clot Sliver and Crypt Sliver. These give each of our slivers an activated regenerate ability. Clot Sliver's ability does not require you to tap a sliver down to activate it, but instead pay 2 generic mana. Crypt Sliver does require you to tap a sliver, but does not cost any mana in order to activate the ability. As a note, you cannot regenerate a sliver that you are sacrificing, as sacrificing is part of the cost of Necrotic Sliver's ability. As a third protection spell, we have Rush of Vitality, which is notable for not being a sliver, but instead being a sorcery, which, until end of turn, gives Indestructible, Lifelink, and +1/+0. It costs a black and a generic mana to cast, and I just realized I read that card backwards. That's the kind of groundbreaking innovation you can expect from this channel. We also have Mindlash Sliver, Enduring Sliver, and Armor Sliver. Mindlash Sliver costs 1 black mana and has all slivers have pay 1 generic mana. Each player discards a card. This means that you also have to discard a card if you have any in hand. Be ready for that. Despite the downside on this card, it's entirely capable of putting your opponents into top deck mode. Enduring Sliver gives each of our slivers Outlast for 2 generic mana, allowing us to pump them up. Armor Sliver allows us to pump up their toughness stat for 2 generic mana, like a reverse fire-breathing type of effect. We also have some slivers that are merely around to act as inexpensive foot soldiers and fodder for Necrotic Sliver. Metallic Sliver, Universal Automaton, and Changeling Outcast fit this bill. Metallic Sliver is actually a sliver, while Universal Automaton and Changeling Outcast have Changeling, so they're really all creature types, including Sliver. That's also true of Avian Changeling, Venomous Changeling, and Moonglove Changeling. The first of those 2 has flying, and the second has Death Touch. Both make for good blockers or sacrifice fodder. Moonglove Changeling has an activated ability that only costs a single black mana and gives Death Touch until the end of the turn. Finally, we have Irregular Cohort and Hive Stirrings. Both of these are around to create extra bodies to sacrifice to Necrotic Sliver, or one of our other sacrifice outlets. Irregular Cohort is a white 4-mana Changeling, and creates another 2/2 Shapeshifter creature token with Changeling when it enters the battlefield. Hive Stirrings is not a sliver itself, but instead a 3-mana sorcery that allows you to create 2 colorless 1/1 sliver creature tokens. That's all for our slivers, but we still have a few more cards to talk about. Obviously, if we have a sacrifice outlet in our command zone, we want some death triggers. It'd be stupid not to, right? I decided to put only 5 cards with repeatable death triggers in this deck because I found that the rest of the death trigger cards I playtested with gave value, but not as impactful value as these 5, and certainly not enough value to win with. I had an eye out for cards with the words, "When a creature dies," because I wanted them to trigger for each creature death, no matter who controls the creature. This allows us to sacrifice a sliver using Necrotic Sliver's ability, and get a death trigger, and then target an opponent's creature with that ability, destroy it, and get another death trigger. That's double death triggers per sliver sacrificed. It's like a C-grade version of Tasia Karlov, but even a C-grade version of Tasia Karlov is pretty decent in PDH. So among these we have Death Greeter, Sadistic Glee, and Eternal Thirst. The first two both cost a single black mana to cast. Death Greeter is a creature that will give you a life each time another creature dies, and Sadistic Glee will put a +1/+1 counter on the creature it's enchanting each time a creature dies. Eternal Thirst is also a creature aura, but costs 1 generic mana more to cast than Sadistic Glee, but like Sadistic Glee, it will add counters when a creature dies, though those creatures do have to be creatures that your opponents control. It does not trigger with your own creatures. Its life gain ability will come in handy though, and pumping up a creature can be very useful. The last two death trigger cards in the deck are Falkenrath Noble and Warteye Witch. Falkenrath Noble is a classic Aristocrats payoff card, draining 1 life from a target player and giving that life to you each time a creature dies. Warteye Witch is a 3/2 Goblin Shaman that costs 3 mana and is the only one of the 5 cards that triggers only when another creature that you control dies. I left this one in there because the Scry 1 effect can be very useful in this deck. We want to find win conditions and more slivers as quickly as possible, and scrying helps do that. After getting some death trigger cards into the battlefield, it's imperative that we get creatures to die. I think it's time we talked about removal. Now that we've talked about removal, let's briefly go over the land base. We have 36 lands and we're going to go through them one by one, so this video takes another half an hour. First we'll talk about the utility lands, then I'll show you how many basics we have. For utility lands, we'll start with our only actual Grave Hate card in the deck, Bojuka Bog. Like always, it's tempting to put this down when you're about to miss a land drop, but hold off if at all possible because it annihilates a graveyard. We also have Mortuary Mire and Witch's Cottage, which don't recur creatures to your hand, but rather to the top of your library. It's not as good as cards that do recur to your hand, but when you desperately need a specific creature card from your graveyard, they're useful. Witch's Cottage has the bonus that if you already have 3 or more swamps on the battlefield, it enters the battlefield untapped. For color fixing, we have Command Tower, which taps for either of our colors, Orzhov Guildgate, which also taps for either of our colors, but enters tapped, and Scoured Barrens, which is exactly like the Guildgate, except that it gives you a life when it enters the battlefield. Finally, we have our basic lands, 15 plains, and 14 swamps. And that's all 95 cards of the deck. Ha! I fooled you again, you silly little person. I left 5 cards out. I did it exclusively so that I could pigeonhole in a segment that uses Baron von Count's art that I like to call The Final Countdown! A segment in which I hand select 5 cards from the 99 and then sort them into a very particular order, that order being 5 through 1. At number 5, we have a card that's very boring because it's a land, but also awesome because it does a thing. And that thing is Recursion. Its name is Haunted Fengraf. I didn't think 7 cards that bring creatures back to my hand was good enough, so I added an 8th in the last place my opponents would expect. The only place that can't be counterspelled. The land base. Eat it, Talrand. Oh, and at number 5 I mentioned that we have 7 cards that bring creatures back from our graveyard. But if you've gone back and counted and realized I only listed 6, well, aren't you an overachiever? At number 4 we have the 7th, and its name is Death Denied. It costs X and 2 black mana, and says return X target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. This scales wonderfully throughout the game, as long as throughout the game doesn't include the first 2 turns. In the late game, you can sacrifice a bunch of your slivers to blow up your opponent's board, and by board I mean lands, and then bring all of those slivers back to hand and cast them again. Who needs friends anyway? I did mention at the start of the video that the deck is Sliver Tribal with a few surprises for our opponents. We've been flying pretty low to the ground with a ton of 3 CMC cards and lower. Now it's time to use our lands and our ramp to drop the hammer. In the spirit of Necrotic Sliver, who just wants to destroy the entire world, we have these 3 beauties. At number 3, he's a big boy, well, a big thing that just wants to eat the world. And its name is Hand of Emrakul. It costs 9 colorless mana, making it our highest CMC spell in the deck, so it's a good thing we've been ramping. It's a 7/7 but lacks trample, so you know, it's not that good. And it's only Annihilator 1, so again, not that good. Your opponent shouldn't even pay attention to it. It's not like you're gonna attack them with it. Probably. Which brings us to number 2. It's colorless, it's big, it also lacks trample, and also wants to eat the world. It's Ulamog's Crusher. For the low cost of 8 mana, you can have an 8/8 Eldrazi with Annihilator 2 on your side, destroying your opponent's board and attacking each and every turn. Not just because you want it to, but also because it has to. It's in the rules. Now at number 1, we have a card that combos nicely with Rush of Vitality and Basil Sliver. It's one of the only board wipes in Pauper EDH, and it is one sick puppy. That is, if it were puppies that had the bubonic plague and then spread it to humanity in the 14th century. It's Crypt Rats. Yay! On its own, it's a very good board wipe, but if you give Crypt Rats lifelink and have Basil Sliver on the battlefield, this may just blow everyone else out of the game with you being the only one left alive. Or maybe you don't blow everyone out, but instead have a sadistic glee on the rats before using Rush of Vitality. You'll have one huge rat, and it'll be the only creature on the board. Swing away, my friend. You've earned it, because you just won by using the number 1 card in this deck. Well, that was a rousing countdown in some particular order. But you know what that means. We've come to the end of our show today. I want to thank you for watching this episode of The Uncommon Commander. If you enjoyed this deck tech, you can find a link to it in the video description. Each deck I make a video for can be found at my tapped out page. Again, if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you did, please click on the thumb up icon on your screen and subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss our future content. Also, feel free to leave a comment below or email me at uncommoncommander@gmail.com, spelled exactly how it sounds. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, friends.